Hello and welcome! Today I'm going to walk you through a step-by-step guide on how to time your injection pump, regardless on if you have the older style, which I have in my B5 Passat here, or the newer style, which I have on this engine, which is on my engine stand. Now, you might have stumbled onto this clip and are now wondering why you would even need to do this. Well, if you have recently changed your timing belt or for some other reason had the timing belt off, then it is a very good idea to do this, because otherwise you could suffer from poor fuel economy, a sluggish engine, i.e. less horsepower, or even if it's too retarded, an excessive amount of black smoke, which isn't really healthy. So, depending on which engine you have, the method of adjusting it is a bit different. And if you don't know which one you have, simply pop off your inspection cover, and if your injection pump sprocket has 3 small bolts on it, then you have the new style. If it doesn't, you have the old style. But before we begin, here's the tools you're going to need for each specific engine. If you have the newer style of adjustment, you are going to need a 13mm socket with a short extension on a ratchet spanner, and a ratchet spanner or a breaker bar with a 22mm socket, or possibly a combination spanner in 22mm. Now, if you have the older style, you're going to need the aforementioned 13mm socket, short extension and ratchet spanner, but with an additional longer extension, possibly. Then you're going to need a 13mm combination spanner, a 19mm 12-point socket. This is to rotate the crank, and on both my ALH and my AFN engine it was a 19mm, but yours could be different. It could be a 24 or something. I don't really know all of the different TDI engines, so check that first. Then some adjustable pliers or a pipe wrench. These are not strictly necessary, but if your pump is kind of stuck, like mine probably will be, this will make it a whole lot easier. And obviously you're going to need VCDS on both of the different types of engines as well. The first step is to get your engine coolant above 80 degrees Celsius. This is necessary in order to get a correct reading when checking the timing in VCDS. So preferably take your car for a spin rather than letting it warm up by idling. This is especially important on a diesel engine, as it is more thermal efficient than a petrol engine, thus will take a long time to heat up by idling, which will cause the engine to wear out faster in the long run. With the engine nice and warm, it's time to disassemble your engine bay to gain access to the pump itself. Quick note here. It isn't necessary to start with the disassembly if you're uncertain whether your timing needs adjusting or not. If that's the case, just skip ahead to the timestamp shown right now and check the timing first. But for the purposes of this video, I'm not going to show that part, because that would only be vehicle specific to a B5 Passat anyway, and considering that these engines ended up in a myriad of makes and models, it's just pointless to do. So let's skip ahead to when I have disassembled this and continue with the pump itself. Alright, now that you've removed everything needed to get to this point, we can get to the fun stuff, which is the timing itself. So let's begin with the AFN engine, the rotating the pump housing style. That way I can show you live how to adjust it, what happens when you adjust it too much, etc. So let's begin with this one, and then we will get on with this one, which I can only show mechanically how to do. Obviously I can't hook a computer up to it. But even if you have this engine, I really recommend you to watch me adjust this one, because the process of what you should think about is exactly the same. The only difference is you can have the engine on here compared to that one where it has to be off. Therefore, you can only check your result after you have adjusted and retorqued the bolts again. So let's begin. Since this engine is adjusted while running, we have a few nuts and bolts to crack loose before we proceed. We begin with two nuts that are hiding behind the pump sprocket. Therefore, we need to rotate the engine in order to line the holes in the sprocket up with the nuts. They are located at between 9 and 10 and 5 and 6 respectively. If you have a pesky mechanical fan like I do here, then this is where that longer extension comes in handy. Oh, and remember to just crack the nuts loose, don't remove them. Alright, 2 out of 3 loose. Now there's just the one in the back to loosen before we start the engine. This one here, the last one, we won't crack open before VCDS is up and running and engine is on. Now it's really hard to film it because it's below the high pressure fuel lines up to the injectors. But it is here. Now you don't have to loosen it that much, since that one isn't spring loaded unlike the one in the front. And they are spring loaded, so the pump won't just when the engine is running. So that's good, they thought of that. So the next part isn't strictly necessary, so it's up to you if you want to do it or not. But some people do, some people don't. I, at this point, usually crack the high pressure fuel lines loose. And that is because they can bind up and resist your timing adjustment, so that if you let the pump housing loose, they can actually twist it back to where it was, which would defeat the purpose and meaning you can't let it go until you have tightened it. Plus, the strain on them afterwards is not really ideal. Sure, you can crack them loose after you have adjusted it and then just tighten them again. But I would rather just have them just tiny bit loose. And what I mean by loosen them is crack them loose to super light and then just snug them a bit, because you don't want a bunch of fuel just pouring out of here. Just to show some of them, just crack it loose and then keep on twisting it loose. Now it's fully loose. Then just there. Now I can feel resistance, so I stop there. If it leaks a bunch despite this, I would just tighten it some more, but that will do for now. Then I just do that on all 4, or 6 if you have a V6. There. But remember to check the amount of fluid squishing out from there. Best case scenario, you have none. Worst case scenario, you have to tighten them up again. If you do this, again, some people do, some people don't. Now then, fire up the engine, fire up the VCDS, and then we can just start to... So, locate the diagnostic port in your car and connect the OBD cable. Start the engine and connect the other end of your cable to the device you're using VCDS on. Fire up VCDS. Click on Select Control Module. Now, it's always a good idea to check fault codes before doing any type of work in VCDS, as a fault code can make you work with false readings without knowing otherwise. So if you have any fault codes in this case that's related to temperature or airflow meter, you need to sort them out before continuing. But since this was blank for me, let's head back to the previous menu and click on Measurement Blocks. Now you have 2 choices. You can click the up arrow till you get to group 4, or alternatively you can just type 004 here and hit enter. Now you're confronted with 4 bits of very useful values which you should take into account when timing the engine. Let's begin with start of injection. which is exactly as the name suggests. It shows the specified and actual degree before TDC that the injectors start injecting. You want the actual value to mirror the specified value, but here's the kicker. See the duty cycle value to the right? This N108 valve is what's adjusting your timing while driving down the road. It can give as much as 18 degrees of advance if the RPMs or load on the engine demands it. Well, my value of between 60 to 70% means that it has already advanced that much of its total adjustment capacity in order to meet the specified value of start of injection. This tells us that the timing on my engine is going to be very retarded. The lowest the N108 valve can go is 2.8%, but you do not want it pegged at that value when you're done either. You want the actual start of injection value to match the specified one and the duty cycle to be at around 4 to 6%. This is because in some driving scenarios your engine may not need more than 0.5 to 1 degree of timing, namely at light loads and low RPM. And if you peg the duty cycle at 2.8% with the actual value meeting the specified start of injection value, your engine will not be able to retard any more than to 1.3 degrees before TDC, which will affect your fuel economy negatively. It's a good idea to check if your coolant temperature is still above 80 degrees while in measuring blocks, and just a click up to group 5 or 7 will confirm it. If it is below 80, just let it idle until it reaches it again. Moving on, let's go back and click on basic settings. Keep it at group 000 and click Go. You will see a new button appear at the bottom right corner named TDI Timing. Click on that. You will probably hear the engine change its note upon doing this, as the dynamic timing adjustment is switched off in order to be able to read and adjust your static timing. For example, if you remember, my duty cycle is between 60 and 70%. Meaning it will retard by about 11 to 12 degrees of timing to its static value when I do this, which is the cause for the audible change in engine note. Now you need to select your engine from the list at the bottom right. So here's where the magic happens. The bottom red line and the top green line represent the most retarded and the most advanced timing respectively, as recommended by VW. The blue line is the ideal timing. Normally you would see two yellow lines intersecting, one horizontal and one vertical. Where these two meet on the graph is what your timing is. My lines doesn't show because, as I suspected, my timing is very retarded, so much so that the only part we see is this yellow dot jumping around at the bottom. If you don't see any lines when viewing this graph, then you also have a timing that is retarded too much, or possibly you have the wrong engine selected in the list. Alright, so let's crack the last bolt loose and make our first adjustment. You can probably adjust the pump housing by hand if you don't live in the Rust Belt, but since I do, I'm going to use a pipe wrench. Now, if I advance it a bit, you can see the two yellow lines I mentioned earlier. One thing to note though, I mentioned that if all you can see is a dot jumping around at the bottom, then your timing is too retarded to show on the graph. Well, that also means that if you can only see a vertical line, then your timing is too advanced. Right? Well, there is an asterisk here. You see, if I retard the timing again to about where it was, and then some more, then it suddenly behaves as if the timing is too advanced to show in the graph, which is displayed by a single vertical line like this. I am showing you this because if your timing looks to be way too advanced, like it does here, but you can't get both lines into view by retarding it, then try and advancing it. So, anyway, I'm going to advance the timing to be just above the blue line. Tighten the bolt so I can let the pump go. Then check group 4 in measurement blocks to see where that lands me in regards to start of injection and duty cycle readings. As you can see, the duty cycle is still high and more adjustment is required. Usually the timing sits close to the blue line when you're done, but in this case I need to advance it a bit more. Since my N108 valve is currently compensating by advancing it more than what I have adjusted, the only way to get it to lower percentages is to advance. If the duty cycle is pegged at 2.8% for you, however, then you need to retard it to get to between 4 and 6%. Perhaps some of you feel that this is daunting to try, but it really isn't as complicated as I perhaps make it sound. Just try it. But promise me to be mindful of where you stick your fingers, since a running engine can lop them off if you're not careful. There, now that it's closer to the green line, let's check it again. Turns out, now I have adjusted it just a smidge too far and need to retard it just a tiny amount. You know the drill by now. Loosen the bolt, adjust and tighten the bolt again, so I won't show me doing that. Let's just watch this graph instead. Besides, the adjustment is so small you couldn't see me move the pipe wrench at all. I want to land precisely below this line, which is going to require a minuscule adjustment. There! Let's check grip 4 one more time. And that's perfect! You can close the program now because you're done. There you have it. Assuming you adjusted it as I did here, you will have the best possible fuel economy for everyday driving. And the pump itself is more than capable of meeting the advanced timing needs of higher RPMs on a stock engine. Besides, a stock engine is anemic about 3800 to 4000 RPMs anyway, so you don't really have a reason to revving it out more than that. Alright. Time to tighten everything again, starting with the one in the back. You can see that my high pressure fuel lines leaked a bit, which is no biggie as long as you don't see a big spray pattern coming out from one of them, because that could be dangerous for you, hitting you in the eye or something. The pressure is kind of high. If I remember correctly, 200 to 230 bars, so it would suck to get that on your skin. Oh, and obviously you torque it in the rear here, you know, like click, click. This one is obviously already tight, and now we need to rotate the engine, or wait, perhaps it stopped in the right, no. We need to rotate the engine to the correct position. Oh, before that, we need to tighten the high pressure fuel lines I was just talking about. And remember, these are not supposed to be very tight. They seal perfectly without you just going Hulk on them. Lastly, to get torqued after a quick rotation of the crank, the two nuts in the front. What's left after that is what you had to disassemble on your vehicle in order to get access to the pump. So, moving on to adjustment of the ALH, which is going to be much simpler in a way, because you won't have to rotate the engine or crack the high pressure fuel lines loose or anything. You only need to gain access to what's behind this cover. So, if we crack this loose and one more down here, and take this off like so. Before we begin the adjustment procedure on the ALH though, you first need to establish if you have the stretch or non-stretch version of these 3 small bolts. Because the earlier engines came with the stretch bolts and later engines came with the non-stretch. So just remove one of the 3 bolts. Don't crack the other 2 loose just yet. So this is what a reusable bolt looks like. It can be green tinted like this, or it can be gold tinted or plated. But the important part is that a non-reusable bolt, a stretch bolt, will have a thinner portion below the head, which is going to be where the stretching happens. And it's also cone-shaped at the bottom, so it's tapered. If you have those kind of bolts, you need to stop doing this and head to the dealer, buy 3 new ones, then you can continue. Now that you have your new bolts, you can go ahead and swap them one by one, and you want to do it that way because the pump is going to move if you loosen all 3 at once. So one by one, that way your timing remains the same, so you know how to clock it when these are swapped. So this can go back in. This is where your I'm not asking bar comes into play with a 22mm socket. Because when you crack the 3 adjustment bolts loose, you really need to use all of your strength in order to hold the pump internals in place. No, not really. The real reason is it's easier to use a long breaker bar to make small adjustments, since big movements out here equals small movements at the rotational center, i.e. the pump shaft. So, now it's time to crack him loose, but before we do that, preload the bar clockwise a bit, because in my experience, the pump internals are under tension and want to rotate backwards, so counterclockwise. So just hold it a bit, but not too much, because then you will advance the timing as soon as the last bolt is loose. Just be ready to catch it. Now, crack the 3 bolts loose. Now it's time to advance or retard the timing depending on where it was in your timing graph. And again, counterclockwise towards the engine to retard, and clockwise away from the engine to advance. So, make your adjustment, let's say like so, for me. Now you need to tighten it back up. Then it's simply a rinse and repeat until you get the adjustment correct. It can take a while, so be patient. I think my first time it took me probably 7 or 8 times before I got the adjustment right, and that was on this engine many years ago. That's why I use a breaker bar now, because I can fine-tune it better. Then when you're satisfied with your new timing, it's time to put the engine back together again. A quick note though, if you did this timing adjustment because you have replaced your timing belt, you need to check it again, the timing that is, in 1 to 2 months, because all of the new parts will settle in and can potentially alter your timing. I've seen it happen on this particular engine, so check it again in 1 to 2 months to make sure. Time to slap it together. Alright, that's it. I hope you found this video useful, and if you did, I would be immensely grateful if you would hit the like button below. And while you're down there, why don't you consider subscribing and hitting the bell icon as well? That way you can follow along on my various projects I have around here, and the occasional how-to video like this one. Anyway, good luck with your timing adjustment regardless of which engine you have. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask them below. Cactus8, signing out.